Zorro by Johnston Macaulay. The people in this story are Sergeant Gonzalez, Don Diego Vega, Don Carlos Pulido, Doña Catalina Pulido, Señorita Lolita Pulido, Captain Ramon, Don Alejandro Vega, Fray Philip, Zorro, and the Governor of California. Chapter 1. A Stormy Night. One dark night in February, a group of soldiers were sitting in a small inn. The inn was on one side of Los Angeles town square. Outside, the weather was wild and stormy. Rain was crashing on the roof and the wind was making a terrible noise. But inside, it was bright and comfortable. The soldiers sat in front of a warm fire, drinking wine and playing cards. "Bring more wine, landlord!" shouted a big man with a mustache to the owner of the inn. The man with the mustache was the soldiers' leader, Sergeant Gonzalez. "Yes, senor," said the fat landlord. He hurried to fill Gonzalez's cup with wine. He was afraid of the big sergeant. Sergeant Gonzalez was a strong man and he became angry very easily. He often fought with other soldiers. "Talking is better than fighting," thought the landlord. "What can I say that will interest Gonzalez?" "People in the town are talking about Senor Zorro," he said quickly. "He has been seen in Los Angeles again." Gonzalez threw his cup of wine onto the floor. "Senor Zorro?" he cried out in a terrible voice. "Must I always hear that name? I hate it. This man Zorro is very clever. Nobody knows who he is. Nobody has seen his face. He wears a black mask with 2 holes for his eyes. He cuts the faces of his enemies with his sword. He marks them with a shape like the letter Z. People call it the mark of Zorro." "But Zorro has never visited us here, Sergeant," said the landlord nervously. "No," said Gonzalez. "And why not? Because I'm here and he's afraid of me. I'm the best soldier in the Governor of California's army." "Has Senor Zorro ever killed anybody?" asked the landlord. "No, not yet," replied Gonzalez slowly. "He tells people I'm not a real thief. I only punish the enemies of the poor and the weak." "But Zorro's days will soon be over," Gonzalez went on. "The governor has offered a reward for him. He'll pay a lot of money to the man who kills Zorro." "I don't want Zorro to come here," said the landlord. "Let him come," shouted Gonzalez. "I'm waiting for him. I'll kill him and I'll get the reward. Suddenly, the door opened and a man walked into the inn. Everybody stared at him in surprise. Gonzalez pulled his sword from its scabbard. He was ready to fight, but the man was not Zorro. It was Don Diego Vega. The Vega family was one of the richest families in Southern California. They had lived there for many years. They owned a large amount of land and a huge number of cattle and horses. Don Diego, the only son of the noble family, was 24 years old and he was very handsome. He owned a beautiful hacienda, a large country house, and also a fine house in Los Angeles. This townhouse was opposite the inn. Don Diego was different from most of the other young men in the town. He did not enjoy loud talk or fighting. He was not interested in winning the love of women. He liked music, poetry, and quiet conversation. Don Diego and Sergeant Gonzalez were very different kinds of men, but they were friends. Don Diego often bought wine for Gonzalez and he liked to listen to the sergeant's conversation. Sergeant Gonzalez put his sword back into the scabbard. "I'm sorry, my friend," he said to Don Diego. "I didn't want to frighten you. I couldn't see your face in the darkness. We were just talking about that thief, Zorro." "Not Zorro again," said Diego in a tired voice. He looked bored. "I don't like stories about blood and violence. You know that. I really don't want to hear about Zorro." "But the governor has offered a very good reward for him," Gonzalez answered, "and I'm going to get it. I'm going to catch Zorro. I'll tell you all about it when I get the reward. I'll tell you how I caught him, how I killed him." "Gonzalez, please don't talk about killing," said Don Diego. "I've heard enough." He called to the landlord. "Give Sergeant Gonzalez more wine," he said. "Then perhaps he will stop talking." The landlord hurried to bring wine for the two men. Don Diego drank his wine slowly, but Gonzalez drank very quickly. After half an hour, Don Diego stood up. "I have to go home now," he said. "But the weather is very bad," said Gonzalez. "My soldiers will go with you. They'll take you home safely." "No, no," replied Don Diego. "Let them stay here by the fire. I don't need soldiers. Give your men some more wine. I'll pay for it later. Good night." "Good night, Señor," everybody said. When Don Diego had gone, Gonzalez spoke to his soldiers. "That young man is very unusual," he said. "He isn't interested in fighting. He isn't interested in winning the love of women. But he is my good friend. He's a fine young man." All the soldiers agreed with Gonzalez. Don Diego was going to pay for their wine, so they were very happy. The fat landlord was happy too. Sergeant Gonzalez stood up and he pulled out his sword again. He waved it in the air. "Don Diego doesn't like fighting," he shouted. "But I do. Why doesn't Zorro come now? I'm ready for him." At the moment, the door opened again and a stranger entered the room. Chapter 2. The Man in the Mask. The stranger stood in the dark shadows by the door. His large sombrero was pulled down over his eyes. He wore a long dark cloak around his body. The landlord hurried towards him. Then the stranger stepped forward into the light. Now everybody could see him clearly. The landlord stopped and cried out in fear. Gonzalez's eyes were wide with surprise. The stranger was wearing a black mask. There were 2 holes in the mask. Through these holes, his bright eyes were watching everything. "I'm Senor Zorro," replied the man, "and I'm here to speak to you." He pointed at Gonzalez. "What do you mean?" asked Gonzalez. "I know what kind of man you are, Sergeant Gonzalez," replied Zorro. "4 days ago, you stopped a man on the road and beat him cruelly. The man was poor and weak. He hadn't done anything wrong. I'm a friend of that poor man. I've come to punish you." Zorro was telling the truth. Gonzalez had beaten a man on the road. The sergeant remembered that, but then he remembered the governor's reward too, and he smiled. "Very well, Senor Zorro," he said. "We will fight." He pulled out his sword and walked towards Zorro. But Zorro put his hand under his cloak and brought out a pistol. He pointed the gun at Gonzalez. "What's that?" said Gonzalez. He began to laugh. "Are you going to shoot me with your pistol? You aren't very brave, Senor Zorro. You're afraid of my sword. It's very easy to kill somebody with a pistol, but a sword fight is difficult." "There are many of your men in this room," Zorro replied. "We will fight with swords, but it must be a fair fight." He pointed the pistol at the soldiers and the landlord. "Get back," he said to them. "Stand by the wall." The soldiers and the landlord stood against the wall. "I'm going to fight with my sword in my right hand, but I hold the pistol in my left," Zorro told them. "I'll shoot anybody who moves." Then he turned towards Gonzalez. "Now, Senor, I'm ready to begin," he said. Gonzalez ran towards Zorro with his sword, but Zorro's sword pushed it away. Again and again, Gonzalez tried to attack Zorro. He tried many tricks, but he could never reach Zorro's body with his sword. Zorro's eyes were bright behind the mask. He was smiling. Gonzalez did not fight well. He had drunk too much wine and he was getting tired. When Zorro saw this, he moved forward and began to attack Gonzalez. Slowly, he pushed the sergeant back against the wall. Zorro was not smiling anymore. His eyes were cold and angry behind the mask. Suddenly, Zorro moved quickly and knocked Gonzalez's sword out of his hand. It fell on the floor with a loud noise. Gonzalez closed his eyes. He was ready to die. But at the moment, the door opened again. A large group of men from the town came in. They were looking for food and drink. Zorro could not fight so many men. He put his sword back into its scabbard and he jumped onto a chair near a window. "We haven't finished our fight, Senor," he said to Gonzalez. "Goodbye until the next time." Then Zorro jumped through the window and disappeared into the night. The soldiers rushed out of the inn, but they could not see anything in the darkness and the rain. Zorro had escaped. The soldiers went back into the warm room. "Did you see Zorro?" Gonzales was saying to the men from the town. "That man doesn't fight in a fair way. He will only use a pistol, not a sword. I had to throw my sword to the ground." Gonzales was not telling the truth, but nobody disagreed with him. A minute later, Don Diego hurried back into the inn. "What's happening here?" he asked. "What's all this noise?" "Señor Zorro was here," replied Gonzales. "Was he?" asked Don Diego. "But where is his dead body?" The landlord and the soldiers smiled. Gonzales's face became red. "Well, there is no body," he said. "Have your men taken it away?" asked Don Diego. "Tell me all about the fight. Tell me how you caught him, how you killed him." Don Diego laughed. "Now you will get the reward, Sergeant." Gonzales did not say anything. The soldiers watched him. "I don't understand. You did kill Zorro, didn't you?" "Zorro escaped," said Gonzales at last. "He had a pistol. He got away." "Well, why didn't you take his pistol from him?" asked Don Diego. "Tell me, I don't understand about fighting," he shouted to the landlord. "Bring more wine for Sergeant Gonzales." But Gonzales did not want any more wine. "I have to speak to the Comandante," he said. "I must tell him about the fight. Good night." Before Gonzales left the inn, he turned and shouted, "But next time I meet Señor Zorro, I'll kill him." Don Diego looked towards the fire and he smiled.